Billionaire entered the court with divorce papers until his wife appeared carrying their newborn baby. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. Cameron Vale had signed billion-dollar contracts without blinking, but today, his hands trembled as he gripped the leather portfolio containing his divorce papers. The courthouse hallway buzzed with the usual chaos. Attorneys rushing between rooms, families clustered on wooden benches, the sharp click of heels against marble floors. But Cameron heard none of it. His mind was laser-focused on one thing. Finally, ending the marriage he had systematically destroyed through his own indifference. He straightened his charcoal suit jacket and checked his Rolex. 2:47 p.m., 13 minutes early. Just as he preferred for every important meeting, except this wasn't a merger or acquisition. This was the legal burial of 4 years with Isabel Thorne. 2 years of genuine love, followed by 2 years of emotional abandonment. The courthouse clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, had already warned him that divorce proceedings involving children required additional documentation. Cameron had nodded curtly, his jaw tight. He knew about the child. Of course he knew. He'd received every hospital bill, every pediatric appointment notification forwarded by his assistant. He'd simply chosen to treat them like spam emails. Acknowledged but ignored. Room 304, Family Court. Judge Marlowe, presiding. Cameron pushed open the heavy oak door, his Italian leather shoes silent against the worn carpet. The courtroom was smaller than he'd expected, with fluorescent lighting that cast everything in an unflattering pale glow. His attorney, a sharp-dressed woman named Tempest Morrison, was already seated at the plaintiff's table, organizing files with mechanical precision. "Mr. Vale," she nodded professionally. "Ready to proceed. Let's get this over with," Cameron replied, settling into the chair beside her. His fingers drummed once against the table, the only outward sign of the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. Judge Marlowe, a stern-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, reviewed the case file. "Vale versus Vale," he announced. Petition for dissolution of marriage filed by the courtroom door creaked open behind them. Cameron didn't turn around immediately. He'd learned to compartmentalize distractions during high-stakes negotiations. But something about the quality of silence that followed made his shoulders tense. Footsteps soft, deliberate, the kind Isabel used to make when she was trying not to wake him after his late-night conference calls with Tokyo investors. "Your Honor," came a familiar voice that sent an electric shock through Cameron's chest. "I apologize for the delay." He turned then, and the carefully constructed walls around his heart cracked like ice under pressure. Isabel stood in the doorway, but she wasn't alone. In her arms, nestled against a soft blue sweater that brought out her hazel eyes, was a baby, 9 months old, with thick dark hair that caught the fluorescent light and eyes that were unmistakably Vale eyes, the same steel gray that had intimidated countless boardroom opponents. The child was awake, tiny fingers wrapped around the fabric of Isabel's sweater, completely unaware that his mere presence had just shattered his father's composure. Cameron's breath caught, not because he was surprised. He'd known about Elias from the moment Isabel's pregnancy test results appeared in his email, but because seeing his son for the first time was like looking into a mirror that reflected not just his features, but every choice he'd made to avoid this moment. Isabel's eyes found his across the courtroom. There was no anger in them, which somehow made everything worse. There was only the quiet resignation of someone who had stopped expecting anything from him long ago. Judge Marlowe looked up from his files, his expression shifting from routine boredom to careful attention. "Mrs. Vale, I wasn't aware that a minor child would be present today." "Neither was I, Your Honor," Isabel replied calmly, shifting Elias to her other arm with the practiced ease of a woman who had learned to do everything alone. "But childcare fell through, and I couldn't miss this hearing again." The words hit Cameron like a physical blow. How many hearings had he postponed? How many times had she rearranged her life around his schedule, only to receive last-minute cancellations from his assistant? Cameron Vale had built an empire by never showing weakness. But as he sat in that fluorescent-lit courtroom, watching his arranged wife hold the son he'd never bothered to meet, he realized that all his power meant nothing because the two most important people in his world were standing 10 feet away, and he had become a stranger to both of them. The silence in the courtroom stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest movement. Judge Marlowe removed, his reading glasses and studied the scene before him with the careful attention of someone who had witnessed countless family dramas unfold in this very room. But something about the tableau, the composed billionaire, the quietly dignified woman with a baby, and the invisible chasm of pain between them made him pause. Given the presence of a minor child and the complexity of this situation, Judge Marlowe said finally, "I'm going to call a 15-minute recess. Mrs. Vale, Mr. Vale, I suggest you use this time to discuss any matters that might affect today's proceedings." Cameron's attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently about custody arrangements and financial obligations, but her words dissolved into white noise. All he could focus on was Isabel, who was already heading toward the door with practiced efficiency. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly empty courtroom. "Isabel." She stopped, but didn't turn around. Elias had begun to fuss, making soft whimpering sounds that tugged at something primal in Cameron's chest. A recognition he hadn't expected. "We need to talk," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Now you want to talk." Isabel's response was quiet, almost conversational, which made it cut deeper than if she'd shouted. She turned slowly, adjusting Elias against her shoulder with the kind of natural movement that spoke of countless sleepless nights. Interesting timing, Cameron. They found themselves in the courthouse hallway, a stretch of marble and fluorescent lights that felt more like a battlefield than neutral ground. Other families moved around them, an elderly couple arguing over Social Security benefits, a young mother bouncing a toddler while reviewing custody papers, but Cameron felt utterly alone despite being surrounded by people. Elias had quieted, his small head resting against Isabel's collarbone, tiny fingers gripping her sweater. Cameron found himself studying every detail of the child. The way his dark hair curled slightly at the edges, the perfect shell of his ear, the serious expression that made him look like a miniature version of Cameron himself during board meetings. "He looks like you," Isabel said, noticing Cameron's intense scrutiny, stubborn chin and all. "I know." The words came out harsher than Cameron intended. "I mean, I can see it. Can you?" Isabel shifted Elias to her other arm, the movement highlighting how natural this was for her, how much practice she'd had because for 9 months you acted like he didn't exist. Even now you're looking at him like he's a quarterly report you're trying to analyze. Cameron felt heat rise in his chest. "That's not fair." Isabel's laugh was bitter. "You want to talk about fair? I spent 36 hours in labor. Cameron, 36 hours, and you know where you were." He did know. The memory hit him like a physical blow. The Meridian Group acquisition meeting in Singapore. He'd received the hospital's call at 3 a.m. local time and had silenced his phone, telling himself that labor could take days and he'd catch the next flight. But then there had been another call from Hong Kong, then London, then complications with the Brazilian subsidiary contracts. "Singapore," he whispered. "Singapore," she confirmed, "closing a deal that your team could have handled while your son was being born, while I was alone, scared, and bleeding more than the doctors expected." Elias stirred at the tension in his mother's voice, letting out a soft sigh that sounded almost like a question. Isabel immediately softened, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead and murmuring something too quiet for Cameron to hear. The tenderness of the gesture broke something inside Cameron, not because it was performed for his benefit, quite the opposite. It was the unconscious love of a mother who had learned to be everything to her child because the father had chosen to be nothing. "I didn't know about the complications," Cameron said quietly. "You would have if you'd answered your phone or if you'd called back or if you'd shown up to a single appointment in 9 months. Isabel's voice remained steady, but Cameron caught the slight tremor at the edges. "I sent you ultrasound pictures. Cameron, I texted you when he started kicking. I called when the doctor said he was breech and we might need a C-section." Each revelation was a fresh wound. Cameron remembered the notifications, the voicemails, the attached images he'd glanced at briefly before filing them away in a mental folder labeled "Deal with Later." "The night he was born," Isabel continued, "I kept thinking you'd walk through that hospital room door. Even after everything. Some stupid part of me believed that when it mattered, really mattered, you'd show up." Cameron wanted to explain about the Singapore deal, about the 72-hour deadline that would have cost his company millions, about the responsibility he felt to his investors and employees, but standing here looking at the son he'd never held and the wife he'd emotionally abandoned, those explanations felt like ash in his mouth. "I was building something for us," he said finally, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "No, Isabel replied simply. You were building something for you. We were just supposed to wait quietly until you had time for us. A courthouse security guard walked by, his radio crackling with static. The sound seemed to bring them back to the present moment, to the reality of where they were and why they were there. Isabel looked down at Elias, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, his small fist still clutching her sweater. When she looked back up at Cameron, something had shifted in her expression. I'm not trying to hurt you, Cameron. I'm just tired of being invisible. The words hit him with devastating simplicity. Because she was right. Somewhere along the way, he had made the two most important people in his life disappear. Not through malice, but through the far more insidious crime of indifference. And now, standing in a courthouse hallway with divorce papers waiting to be signed, Cameron realized that he was about to make their invisibility permanent. When they returned to the courtroom, Cameron felt like he was walking underwater. Every movement slow, every sound muffled, every breath requiring conscious effort. Judge Marlowe had used the recess to review additional documentation, and now sat with a stack of papers that seemed to represent the mathematical breakdown of their failed marriage. Child support calculations, custody arrangements, asset division, the love they'd once shared reduced to line items, and legal precedents. Before we proceed, Judge Marlowe said, adjusting his glasses, I need to address the matter of parental rights and visitation. Mr. Vale, the court shows no record of you establishing paternity or requesting any form of custody arrangement for the minor child. Cameron's attorney, Tempest Morrison, began to respond, but Cameron held up his hand. He could feel Isabel's eyes on him from across the aisle, could hear Elias making soft babbling sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the formal quiet of the courtroom. That's correct, Your Honor, Cameron said, his voice steadier than he felt. I haven't pursued any custody arrangements. I see. Judge Marlowe made a note. And Mrs. Vale, you're seeking full physical and legal custody with no visitation rights for the father. Isabel shifted Elias to her other arm, the baby now awake and looking around the courtroom with the curious eyes of someone experiencing the world for the first time. Cameron found himself holding his breath, waiting for her response. Isabel began, then stopped. She looked down at Elias, who had reached up to touch her face with his tiny hand. And something passed between mother and child, some wordless communication that Cameron felt excluded from entirely. Your Honor, Isabel said finally, I want what's best for my son. If his father truly wants to be in his life, not just financially, but actually present, then I won't stand in the way of that. The qualification hung in the air like a challenge. If his father truly wants to be in his life, Cameron felt the weight of 9 months pressing down on him, 9 months of ignored phone calls and deleted voicemails, 9 months of treating his son's existence like an inconvenience to be managed by assistants and lawyers, 9 months of choosing Singapore over the delivery room, choosing Tokyo conference calls over first words, choosing London mergers over first steps. Mr. Vale, Judge Marlowe's voice cut through Cameron's thoughts. Do you wish to establish visitation rights with your son? The question should have been simple. Yes or no. Legal jargon and court orders. But Cameron found himself looking across the courtroom at Elias, who was now staring directly at him with those unmistakable Vale eyes. For a moment, father and son regarded each other across the divide of months and missed opportunities. Elias didn't cry or fuss or look away. He simply studied Cameron with the intense focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle. And then, impossibly, the baby smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small upturn of his mouth accompanied by a soft cooing sound, but it hit Cameron like lightning. This recognition from a child who had every reason to see him as a stranger. Cameron started, then found he couldn't finish the sentence. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud would make it real, would mean admitting that he wanted something he'd spent 9 months convincing himself he didn't need. Tempest Morrison leaned toward him. Cameron, we need to establish your position for the record. But Cameron wasn't thinking about legal records anymore. He was thinking about the ultrasound images he deleted without opening, the voicemails from Isabel he'd marked as heard without listening, to the birth announcement email he'd archived with the same attention he'd give to a newsletter subscription. He was thinking about the nursery. He'd never seen the middle of the night feedings. He'd never shared the first laugh. He'd never heard. He was thinking about how Elias had smiled at him despite everything. How this tiny person seemed willing to offer what Cameron wasn't sure he deserved. Your Honor, Cameron said slowly, I'd like to request a continuance. The words surprised everyone in the room, including himself. Tempest Morrison's pen froze mid. Judge Marlowe raised an eyebrow. And Isabel. Isabel looked at Cameron with something he hadn't seen in her eyes for years. Hope. Dangerous, fragile hope. A continuance, Mr. Vale? Judge Marlowe asked. On what grounds? Cameron looked at Elias again. This child who carried his name and his eyes and none of his emotional baggage. This son who had somehow managed to exist and grow and develop a personality. During the 9 months, Cameron had been too busy building his empire to notice his family was falling apart. On the grounds that I've been an idiot, Your Honor, Cameron said quietly, and idiots sometimes need more time to figure out what actually matters. Judge Marlowe's mouth twitched with what might have been amusement. That's not typically recognized legal terminology, Mr. Vale. Then let me put it in terms the court will accept, Cameron replied, standing slowly. I request a 30-day continuance to explore the possibility of establishing a meaningful relationship with my son before making any permanent decisions about custody and visitation. The courtroom fell silent, except for Elias, who had begun making happy babbling sounds, as if he approved of this turn of events. Isabel was staring at Cameron with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not trust. He hadn't earned that. Not forgiveness that would take much longer. But maybe, just maybe, the willingness to see if the man she'd once loved was still somewhere underneath the workaholic stranger he'd become. Mrs. Vale, Judge Marlowe said, how do you feel about this request? Isabel looked down at Elias, who was now reaching toward Cameron with chubby, grasping fingers, as if trying to bridge the distance between them. 30 days, she said finally. But this isn't a game, Cameron. If you're going to be in his life, you need to actually be in his life. Not when it's convenient. Not when your schedule allows. Not when you feel guilty enough to show up. Cameron nodded, understanding the weight of what she was offering. A chance. Maybe the only chance he'd get. 30 days, he agreed. But as he said the words, Cameron realized that 30 days wouldn't be nearly enough time to make up for the 9 months he'd already lost. Cameron sat in his Tesla Model S in the courthouse parking lot for 23 minutes after Isabel drove away in her modest Honda Civic, watching her taillights disappear into downtown traffic like fading stars. 23 minutes of staring at his hands on the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. 30 days. He'd asked for 30 days, as if time alone could bridge the chasm he'd created between himself and his family. His phone buzzed with a familiar cascade of notifications, missed calls from his CFO about the Jakarta expansion, urgent emails about the Frankfurt merger, text messages from his assistant about tomorrow's board meeting, the digital heartbeat of his empire, demanding attention with the relentless persistence of a newborn, like Elias probably did during those first nights, he thought, and the comparison made him feel sick. Cameron turned off his phone. The silence that followed felt strange and unsettling. When was the last time he'd sat in complete quiet? When had he last been alone with his thoughts, without the buffer of conference calls and market reports? He started the car but didn't know where to go. His penthouse apartment on Fifth Avenue felt like a mausoleum, all glass and steel and expensive art that meant nothing. His office felt like a prison he'd willingly locked himself into, and he couldn't go to the places that mattered most. Isabel's apartment, wherever that was now, where his son was probably having dinner, or getting ready for a bath, or doing any of the 1,000 small things that made up a life, Cameron had never bothered to learn about. So he drove through the city streets that blurred past his windows like a movie he'd seen too many times, past the restaurant where he'd proposed to Isabel 4 years ago, Antonio's trattoria with the red check tablecloths, and the owner who'd insisted on opening his best wine because love deserves celebration. Past the hospital where Elias had been born while Cameron was 8,000 miles away, closing a deal that had earned him $50 million and cost him everything that actually mattered. Without conscious direction, he found himself in Riverside Park, sitting on a bench overlooking the Hudson River, as joggers and dog walkers moved past him like ghosts. A young father was teaching his daughter to ride a bicycle nearby, one hand on her back, running alongside as she pedaled with determined concentration. "I've got you, sweetheart," the man called out. "I won't let you fall." Cameron watched until they disappeared around the bend, the father's promise echoing in his mind. "I won't let you fall." When had he ever said anything like that to Isabel? When had he ever made a promise about protection instead of profit? His phone, despite being turned off, seemed to weigh heavily in his jacket pocket. He knew that by now, Tempest Morrison had probably called 12 times. His assistant would be fielding questions about his whereabouts. The Tokyo office would be wondering why he hadn't joined the morning strategy call. But for the first time in years, Cameron didn't care about any of it. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found a number he hadn't called in months. His brother Jasper, the family disappointment who'd chosen teaching high school math over joining Vale Ministries. Cameron, Jasper's voice held genuine surprise. Is everything okay? You never call unless someone's dead or you need me to sign something. I saw my son today, Cameron said without preamble. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Cameron wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Jasper spoke, his voice softer than before. How did that go? He smiled at me. The words came out rougher than Cameron intended. I've been absent for 9 months. And he smiled at me like I was someone worth knowing. Kids are good at that, Jasper said carefully. They don't hold grudges the way adults do. They just love whoever shows up. Shows up. The phrase hit Cameron like a physical blow. I didn't show up, Jasper. Not once. Not for anything that mattered. But you're showing up now, right? Cameron looked out at the river where a tugboat was pushing a barge upstream against the current. It looked exhausting. All that effort just to move forward inch by inch. I asked for 30 days, Cameron said, to figure out if I can be a father. Can you? I don't know. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. I don't know anything about babies. I don't know how to change a diaper or what formula to buy or why he might be crying. I don't even know what his laugh sounds like. Those are just details, Cameron. You can learn details. Can I? Cameron's voice cracked slightly. I've built a billion-dollar company from nothing. I've negotiated with world leaders and closed deals that other people said were impossible. But I can't figure out how to be present for a 9-month-old baby. Jasper was quiet for a moment, and Cameron could hear the sounds of his brother's life in the background. A television playing cartoons, a woman's voice calling something about dinner, the comfortable chaos of a home where people actually lived instead of just existing. You know what the difference is, Cameron. What? The billion-dollar company wanted something from you. Your son just wants you. No conditions. No performance metrics, no quarterly returns. He just wants his dad to show up and be there. Cameron closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 30 years of measuring his worth by his productivity. What if I'm too broken to give him that? Then you figure out how to get unbroken, Jasper replied simply. Because that little boy didn't choose to be born to a workaholic father. But you can choose what kind of father you become from today forward. A police siren wailed in the distance, growing louder and then fading away. Someone's emergency. Someone's crisis being handled by people who knew how to show up when it mattered. Jasper? Yeah. How do I start? For the first time in the conversation, Cameron heard his brother smile. One day at a time, brother. One day at a time. After hanging up, Cameron sat on the bench until the sun began to set over the Hudson River, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded him of the ultrasound pictures he'd deleted without looking at. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow, I start figuring out how to be someone's father. But as he walked back to his car, Cameron realized that the hardest part wouldn't be learning about babies or diapers or bedtime stories. The hardest part would be convincing Isabel that this time, finally, after all his failures, he was serious about showing up. Cameron stood outside the baby depot on Madison Avenue at 6:47 a.m., waiting for the store to open like a man preparing for the most important business negotiation of his life. 3 days had passed since the courthouse. 3 days of staring at his phone, typing and deleting text messages to Isabel, trying to find words that didn't sound like boardroom speak or empty promises. 3 days of researching child development like he was preparing for a merger, filling legal pads with notes about milestone charts and feeding schedules. But this morning, he decided to stop overthinking and start doing. The store manager, a cheerful woman named Beverly, with graying curls and kind eyes, unlocked the door at exactly 7 o'clock. She looked surprised to see a man in a $3,000 suit standing outside her baby store at opening time. Can I help you, sir? I need. Cameron paused, realizing he'd never said these words out loud before. I need everything for a 9-month-old baby. Everything. Beverly's eyebrows rose slightly. Everything. I've never. Cameron felt heat creep up his neck. I haven't been involved in my son's life until now. I need to start from the beginning. Something in his tone must have conveyed the gravity of his situation because Beverly's expression softened immediately. Well then, she said, rolling up her sleeves with the efficiency of someone who'd helped countless confused parents, let's get you started. For the next 2 hours, Cameron received what amounted to a crash course in fatherhood. Beverly walked him through the basics: how to hold a baby safely, the difference between various formula types, the mysterious world of diaper sizes, and baby-proofing products. Now, these are the soft tip spoons for when he starts eating more solid foods, Beverly explained, demonstrating with the patience of a seasoned teacher. 9 months is right around when they start getting more independent with feeding, but you'll still need to help. Cameron took notes on everything, his handwriting growing increasingly illegible as he tried to capture information that felt simultaneously overwhelming and essential. By the time they reached the toy section, he had filled 17 pages with details ranging from sleep schedule recommendations to the proper way to burp a baby. The key thing to remember, Beverly said as she showed him age-appropriate toys, is that babies this age are learning about cause and effect. They drop something, you pick it up, they bang 2 blocks together, they make noise. Everything is an experiment to them. An experiment, Cameron repeated, watching her demonstrate how a simple wooden puzzle could help develop motor skills. I understand experiments, Beverly smiled. I thought you might. Now, do you know anything about his current routine? What time he wakes up? When he naps? What foods he likes? The question hit Cameron like cold water. He didn't know any of those things. He didn't know if Elias was an early riser or if he needed a nightlight to sleep. He didn't know what made him laugh or what frightened him. He didn't know if his son had inherited Cameron's stubborn streak or Isabel's gentle nature. I don't know, he admitted quietly. I don't know anything about him. Beverly studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. You know what? That's actually not as unusual as you might think. I've had plenty of dads come in here feeling lost. The difference is, most of them start learning from day one. You're just starting later than most. 9 months later. Better 9 months late than never, she replied pragmatically. Now, here's what I suggest. Start small. Don't try to make up for lost time all at once. Pick 1 or 2 things to focus on. Maybe just spending time together and learning his routine before you worry about the rest. Cameron nodded, grateful for her practical approach. He was used to comprehensive strategies and detailed implementation plans, but maybe parenthood required a different kind of learning curve. By the time he left the store, his Tesla was loaded with what looked like enough supplies for a small daycare center: car seat, stroller, high chair, toys, books, clothes, and multiple sizes because he wasn't sure exactly how big Elias was. Now, the total came to just over $4,000, which felt both excessive and somehow not nearly enough. Now came the harder part, actually using any of it. Cameron sat in his car in the parking lot, staring at Isabel's contact information on his phone. He'd drafted and deleted 47 different text messages over the past 3 days, each one sounding either too casual or too desperate or too much like a business proposal. Finally, he typed something simple. I'd like to see Elias today. When would work for you? Her response came back faster than he'd expected. He has a doctor's appointment at 2 p.m. You could meet us there if you want. Cameron's chest tightened. A doctor's appointment. Another milestone he would have missed if she hadn't mentioned it. Another reminder of how much of his son's life had happened without him. What kind of appointment? He typed back. 9-month checkup, vaccinations, and developmental assessment. Cameron stared at the words, realizing he didn't even know what BAFTAs his son had already received, or what developmental milestones he should be reaching. The research he'd done suddenly felt woefully inadequate. I'll be there, he responded. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, thank you for letting me come. The 3 dots appeared and disappeared several times before her final message came through. He's your son, too. Cameron, despite everything, the words carried the weight of 9 months of absence, but also the faintest suggestion of possibility. Maybe forgiveness wasn't completely out of reach. Maybe redemption was still possible. But first, Cameron realized as he started his car and began navigating toward Dr. Morrison's pediatric office, he had to prove that he was ready to be the father Elias deserved, not just when it was convenient or guilt-driven, but every day through the mundane moments and sleepless nights and countless small decisions that actually shaped a child's life. The appointment was in 4 hours, 4 hours to prepare for seeing his son again, for sitting beside Isabel in a doctor's waiting room, like the family they'd never quite managed to become, for hours to figure out how to be present for something that mattered more than any deal he'd ever closed. The pediatric waiting room smelled like disinfectant and Cheerios, with walls painted in soft pastels that were supposed to be calming, but somehow made Cameron feel more anxious. He arrived 15 minutes early, clutching a leather notebook filled with questions he'd researched online. What percentile should Elias be in for height and weight? Are his motor skills developing normally? How many words should he be saying? The questions of a father trying to compress 9 months of missed observations into a single appointment. When Isabel walked through the door with Elias in her arms, Cameron felt the same electrical jolt he'd experienced in the courtroom, but this time, he was prepared to actually really look at his son. Elias was bigger than he'd seemed in the courtroom, more solid and real. He wore tiny jeans and a blue shirt with a cartoon elephant, and his dark hair had grown long enough to curl slightly at the edges. He was chewing on a rubber teething ring, completely absorbed in the task with the focused determination Cameron recognized from his own approach to problem solving. "Hi," Isabel said quietly, settling into a chair across from Cameron. She looked tired, not just physically, but emotionally exhausted in the way of someone who'd been carrying too much weight alone for too long. "Hi." Cameron closed his notebook, suddenly embarrassed by his list of prepared questions. "How is he?" "He's good, growing fast. He's been pulling himself up on furniture this week, trying to walk." Isabel adjusted Elias on her lap, and Cameron noticed how naturally she moved, every gesture practiced and confident. "Dr. Holloway says he's ahead of schedule on most milestones." Dr. Holloway. Cameron realized he didn't even know his son's doctor's name until this moment. "That's good," he said lamely, "that he's ahead of schedule." Elias looked up at the sound of Cameron's voice, his gray eyes so startlingly similar to Cameron's own, studying his father with curious intensity. For a moment, Cameron thought the baby might cry, might somehow sense his father's long absence and reject him accordingly. Instead, Elias held out his teething ring toward Cameron, making a soft, babbling sound that might have been an invitation to share. "He wants you to have it," Isabel said softly. "He does that when he likes someone." Cameron reached out carefully, accepting the soggy rubber ring as if it were a priceless artifact. "Thank you," he said seriously to Elias, who clapped his hands together with delight at this response. Vale family, a nurse in scrubs, decorated with cartoon animals, appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Holloway is ready for you." The examination room was small and bright, with a pediatric scale and exam table that looked impossibly tiny. Dr. Holloway was a woman, in her 50s with silver-streaked hair, and the kind of gentle competence that immediately put nervous parents at ease. "Mrs. Vale," she said warmly, then turned to Cameron with a politely curious expression. "And you must be Mr. Vale. I don't think we've met before." The words weren't accusatory, but Cameron felt their weight anyway. 9 months of appointments, vaccinations, checkups, and consultations. And this was the first time his son's doctor had seen him. "I've been traveling a lot for work," Cameron said, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. Dr. Holloway nodded professionally and began the examination. She weighed Elias, measured his length, checked his reflexes and muscle tone with practiced efficiency. Throughout the process, she kept up a running commentary directed at both parents. "He's in the 75th percentile for both height and weight. Excellent growth curve. His motor skills are quite advanced. Most babies don't start pulling up until closer to 10 months. She demonstrated how Elias could transfer objects from hand to hand, how he responded to his name, how he could sit steadily without support. Cameron watched, fascinated and heartbroken in equal measure. His son was brilliant, healthy, developing perfectly, and Cameron had missed witnessing all of it. "Now, let's talk about his routine," Dr. Holloway continued. "How's he sleeping?" "Better lately," Isabel replied. "He was waking up twice a night until about 3 weeks ago, but now he usually sleeps through and eating. He loves sweet potatoes and bananas, but he's still not sure about green vegetables. I've been mixing them with things he likes." Cameron listened to this conversation about his son's preferences and habits with the growing realization that he was essentially eavesdropping on someone else's child's medical history. These were intimate details of daily life, sleep patterns, food preferences, growth spurts that should have been shared experiences but were instead foreign territory. "Any concerns about development or behavior?" Dr. Holloway asked. Isabel hesitated for just a moment. "He's been a little more clingy lately, especially when I leave him with the babysitter. I'm wondering if it's separation anxiety. That's very normal at this age," Dr. Holloway assured her. 9 to 12 months is prime time for separation anxiety. It actually indicates healthy attachment development. She glanced at Cameron. "Does he show any recognition of other family members, grandparents, father?" Another loaded question. Cameron felt Isabel's eyes on him, waiting to see how he'd respond. "We're working on that," Cameron said carefully. I haven't been as present as I should have been. Dr. Holloway's expression remained neutral, but Cameron caught the slight tightening round her eyes. She'd clearly seen this scenario before. Absent fathers trying to reconnect after missing crucial bonding time. Well, it's never too late to start building that relationship, she said diplomatically. Consistency is key, though. Babies this age need predictable interactions to develop trust and attachment. Consistency. The word hit Cameron like a diagnosis. He'd built a career on being consistently unavailable, consistently prioritizing work over family, consistently disappointing the people who needed him most. The appointment continued with vaccinations. Elias cried briefly but recovered quickly in Isabel's arms, and scheduling the next checkup in 3 months. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Holloway pulled Cameron aside while Isabel was gathering their things. Can I give you some advice, father to father? She said quietly. I've been doing this for 25 years. And I've seen a lot of dads try to make up for lost time by going overboard. Expensive gifts, grand gestures, trying to become the fun parent overnight. Cameron nodded, thinking of the $4,000 worth of baby supplies currently sitting in his car. That's not what your son needs, Dr. Holloway continued. He needs you to show up regularly, predictably for the boring stuff. Diaper changes, bedtime routines, the 3 a.m. wake-ups. Love isn't a feeling you have once in a while. It's a choice you make every single day. Cameron watched through the doorway as Isabel buckled Elias into his car seat, her movements quick and sure from months of practice. His son was babbling happily, completely secure in his mother's care, completely unaware that his father was standing 5 feet away, feeling like a stranger in his own child's life. How do I start? Cameron asked quietly. How do I become someone he can count on when I've never been that person before? Dr. Holloway smiled, and for the first time since they'd met, her expression held warmth instead of professional courtesy. One day at a time, Mr. Vale, just like everything else worth doing. Cameron's hands were shaking as he knocked on the door of Isabel's apartment at exactly 9 a.m. on Saturday morning. He'd spent the previous evening assembling a crib in his penthouse guest room, following YouTube tutorials with the focused intensity he usually reserved for merger negotiations. The instruction manual was still spread across his dining room table, annotated with his notes like a legal brief. But standing here now, holding a diaper bag that felt foreign in his hands, Cameron realized that no amount of preparation could make him ready for what came next. Actually spending time alone with his son. Isabel opened the door, wearing jeans and a sweater that had seen better days. Her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked beautiful in a way that made Cameron's chest ache. Not the polished beauty she'd worn to corporate events when they were married, but the natural radiance of someone who'd learned to find joy in small moments. You came, she said, and he couldn't tell if she sounded surprised or relieved. I said I would. You've said a lot of things, Cameron. The words stung because they were true. How many promises had he made and broken? How many "I'll be home early tonight" texts had turned into "sorry running late" calls that became "don't wait up for me" silences? Elias appeared in the doorway, pulling himself up on Isabel's leg, with the determined effort of someone who'd recently mastered this particular skill. He was wearing tiny overalls and a striped shirt, and his face lit up when he saw Cameron with an enthusiasm that felt both wonderful and undeserved. Da, Elias babbled, reaching toward Cameron with chubby arms. Cameron's breath caught. Did he just? He says that to everyone, Isabel said quickly, but her tone was gentler than her words. He's been babbling consonants for a few weeks now. It doesn't necessarily mean anything yet. But Cameron knelt down anyway, letting Elias grab onto his fingers with surprising strength. Hey there, buddy, he said softly, and Elias responded with a stream of happy babbling that sounded like the most important conversation Cameron had ever been part of. Isabel handed him a diaper bag that looked like it could supply a small expedition. Everything's labeled. Bottles are already prepared. Just warm them up if he seems hungry. He usually naps around noon, but he might not sleep for you yet. And if he gets really upset, I call you. Cameron finished. Actually, Isabel paused, biting her lower lip in a gesture he remembered from their dating days. I was going to say, if he gets really upset, just hold him and talk to him. Sometimes babies can sense when adults are panicking, and it makes everything worse. Cameron nodded, filing this information away, like intelligence from a critical briefing. How long should I keep him? How long do you want to keep him? The question caught Cameron off guard. In business, time was always negotiated. Precise start and end points, clear deliverables, measurable outcomes, but this wasn't a transaction. This was his son. As long as you're comfortable with, Cameron said, finally. I have some errands to run, maybe 3 hours. Isabel lifted Elias up, kissing his forehead with the casual affection that still amazed Cameron. Be good for Daddy. Okay, sweetie Daddy. The word hit Cameron like lightning. He'd been called many things. Sir, Both, Mr. Vale, the ruthless bastard who destroyed 3 competitors in 1 quarter, but never Daddy. Never anything that suggested someone small and innocent depended on him for comfort and safety. And then Isabel was gone, and Cameron was alone with his son. For the first 10 minutes, they just stared at each other. Elias sat on a colorful playmat surrounded by toys that Cameron didn't know the purpose of, while Cameron sat cross-legged on the floor, trying to figure out what fathers were supposed to do. So, Cameron said finally, feeling ridiculous for talking to someone who couldn't talk back. This is awkward. Elias tilted his head as if considering this statement, then picked up a soft block and threw it directly at Cameron's face. Cameron caught it reflexively, and Elias clapped his hands with delight, making a sound that might have been laughter. Oh, I see. We're playing catch. Cameron gently tossed the block back, and Elias immediately threw it again, this time squealing with joy. For the next 20 minutes, they played this game. Throw the block. Catch the block. Throw it back. It was simultaneously the most boring and most fascinating thing Cameron had ever done. Elias's concentration was absolute, his delight infectious. Every successful catch was celebrated like a major victory. When Elias finally grew bored with blocks, he crawled over to Cameron and pulled himself up using Cameron's shirt, standing unsteadily while gripping the fabric with tiny fists. They were face to face now, and Cameron could see himself reflected in his son's eyes. Not the businessman or the billionaire, just a man who was trying very hard not to mess up the most important job he'd ever been given. You're going to be taller than me, Cameron murmured, and Elias responded by patting Cameron's cheek with one small hand as if offering comfort. The moment was broken by the sound of Elias's stomach rumbling, a surprisingly loud noise from such a small person. Right, Cameron said, consulting the detailed feeding schedule Isabel had left. Lunchtime. He'd watched countless cooking shows, closed deals over elaborate business dinners, but preparing a bottle of formula felt more challenging than anything he'd ever attempted. The water temperature had to be precise, the powder measured exactly, the whole thing tested on his wrist to make sure it wouldn't burn Elias's mouth. When he finally settled into the rocking chair with Elias and the bottle, Cameron felt like he was attempting brain surgery. Elias latched onto the bottle immediately, his eyes drifting closed as he drank. The weight of him in Cameron's arms was perfect. Solid and warm and real, in a way that made everything else in Cameron's life feel abstract by comparison. I'm sorry I wasn't here before, Cameron whispered, and Elias's eyes opened briefly, as if he was listening. I'm sorry I missed so much. I'm sorry your mom had to do everything alone. Elias finished the bottle and immediately fell asleep against Cameron's chest, his small body completely relaxed and trusting. Cameron was afraid to move, afraid to breathe too deeply, afraid to do anything that might break the spell of this perfect moment. When Isabel returned 2 hours later, she found them exactly like that. Cameron in the rocking chair, with Elias sleeping peacefully against his shoulder, both of them looking utterly content. How did it go? She whispered. Cameron looked up at her, his eyes bright with something she hadn't seen in years. Wonder, pure, uncomplicated wonder. He threw blocks at my face, Cameron said quietly. It was the best meeting I've ever had. Isabel smiled. A real smile, soft and genuine. That's his favorite game. He has excellent aim for a knife, just like his mother, Cameron replied without thinking, remembering how Isabel used to throw pillows at him when he was being particularly stubborn about working late. For a moment, something passed between them, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but recognition. Recognition that maybe, possibly, the man she'd fallen in love with was still somewhere, underneath all the emotional armor he'd built around himself. Cameron, she said softly, he's been asleep for an hour. You could have put him in his crib. Cameron looked down at his sleeping son, then back at Isabel. I didn't want to miss anything else. 3 weeks into their new routine, Cameron's phone rang at 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday night, shattering the silence of his penthouse like breaking glass. He'd been reading, actually reading, not skimming market reports, a book about child development that Beverly from the baby store had recommended. His coffee table was now covered with parenting guides instead of financial forecasts, and he'd started keeping a journal of Elias's daily milestones. Tuesday, said Bubba for Bothell. Thursday, took 3 steps holding on to couch. Saturday, laughed when I made funny faces. But the call wasn't from Isabel. It was from his assistant, Vivon Cameron. Thank God you answered. Her voice was strained with panic. The Seoul deal is falling apart. The Koreans are pulling out, unless you're on a plane tonight. Harrison tried to handle it, but they specifically asked for you. Cameron felt his stomach drop. The Seoul acquisition was worth $200 million and had taken 8 months to negotiate. If it collapsed, Vale Industries would lose not just the deal, but credibility with half their Asian partners. What happened? Cameron asked, already mentally calculating flight times to South Korea. Cultural miscommunication during the contract review. Something about honor and respect being compromised. Harrison called them difficult in front of their board, and now they're saying they won't work with anyone except you. Cameron closed his eyes. Harrison Shu was brilliant at financial analysis, but hopeless at international diplomacy. This was exactly the kind of situation that required Cameron's personal attention, the kind of crisis that had made him indispensable to his own company. Book me on the next flight, Cameron said automatically, then stopped. Tomorrow was Wednesday. He was supposed to pick up Elias at 2 p.m. and take him to the park. They'd made plans. Well, Cameron had made plans. Elias had clapped and babbled when Cameron mentioned swings and ducks. Actually, Cameron said slowly, let me call you back in 10 minutes. He hung up and stared at his phone for a long moment, then scrolled to Isabel's number. It was almost midnight, but she answered on the second ring. Cameron, is everything okay? There's a crisis in Seoul, he said without preamble. I need to fly out tonight, and I'm supposed to see Elias tomorrow. The silence that followed felt like falling down a deep well. Of course there is, Isabel said finally, her voice flat with resignation. There's always a crisis, isn't there? This is different. It's a $200 million deal that could collapse. If I don't, it's not different. Cameron, Isabel's voice was quiet, but firm. It's never different. There's always going to be some deal, some crisis, some emergency that's more important than showing up for your son. Cameron felt something crack inside his chest. That's not fair. This is genuinely an emergency. Harrison screwed up, and Harrison screwed up, so you have to fix it. The Seoul deal is falling apart, so you have to save it. The Tokyo merger needs your personal touch. The Frankfurt acquisition can't happen without you. Isabel's voice grew stronger with each word. Do you hear yourself, Cameron? You're the only person who can solve every problem at your company. That's not being indispensable. That's being a control freak who's afraid to trust anyone else to do their job. The words hit Cameron like physical blows, partly because they stung, and partly because they rang uncomfortably true. When had he started believing that Vale Industries would crumble without his constant attention? When had he become so convinced of his own importance that he couldn't delegate a single major decision? It's not that simple, Cameron said weakly. It is that simple. It's a choice, Cameron, every time. And for 9 months, you chose work. You chose deals over diapers, meetings over milestones, contracts over your own child's first words. Isabel's voice cracked slightly. And now you're doing it again. Cameron looked around his penthouse, at the expense of art that meant nothing, at the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased a view of a city he'd conquered but never really lived in. 3 weeks ago, this space had felt like an achievement. Now it felt like a monument to everything he'd sacrificed to build it. What if I don't go? Cameron asked quietly. What if I don't go to Seoul? What if I send Harrison back with a formal apology and my personal guarantee that Vale Industries respects their cultural values? Can you do that? Cameron thought about it, really thought about it, not from the perspective of someone who needed to control every variable, but from the perspective of someone who was finally learning what actually mattered. Yes, he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. I can do that. Harrison's good at his job when he's not trying to be me. And if the deal falls through, Cameron paused, feeling something shift inside him. If it falls through, we'll find another deal. But if I miss another day with Elias, I can't get that back. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Cameron wondered if the call had dropped. Isabel, I'm here. Her voice was softer now, cautious. I'm trying to process what you just said. I'm trying to process it, too, Cameron admitted. 3 months ago, I would have been on that plane without a second thought. Hell, 3 weeks ago, I probably would have been on that plane. What changed? Cameron looked at the parenting book scattered across his coffee table, at the photo of Elias that Isabel had given him, his son's first professional picture taken at 6 months. old, showing a serious little face with Cameron's eyes and Isabel's gentle mouth. "He threw blocks at my face," Cameron said simply, "and I caught them, and for the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be." When Isabel spoke again, Cameron could hear tears in her voice. "Cameron, I'm not asking for forgiveness," Cameron said quickly. "I'm not asking you to trust me or believe that I've changed overnight. I'm just asking you to let me keep showing up. Let me keep catching blocks and warming bottles and being the kind of father who chooses his son over soul. What if your company suffers? What if you lose money?" Cameron smiled, thinking of Ilyas's laugh when he'd made silly faces, of the weight of his son sleeping against his chest, of all the moments he'd already missed, and all the moments he still had a chance to be present for. "Then I lose money," Cameron said, "but I won't lose what matters." When he hung up the phone, Cameron called Vivon back and gave her instructions that would have been unthinkable a month ago. Send Harrison to Seoul with a full apology and Cameron's personal guarantee. Authorize whatever cultural sensitivity training the Korean partners requested. And if the deal fell through anyway, start looking for other opportunities in different markets. "Are you sure about this?" Vivian asked, clearly shocked. "I'm sure," Cameron replied. "And Vivian, clear my schedule for Wednesday afternoon. I have a very important meeting with a 9-month-old about ducks and swings." After hanging up, Cameron sat in the silence of his penthouse and realized that, for the first time in his adult life, he'd chosen love over money, presence over profit, family over everything else that had once seemed so important. And instead of feeling like he'd lost something, he felt like he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all along. The call came at 6:18 a.m. on Friday morning, jolting Cameron from the deepest sleep he'd had in months. Cameron Harrison's voice was tight with exhaustion and barely contained panic. "We lost Seoul." Cameron sat up in bed, immediately alert despite the early hour. For a split second, his old instincts kicked in. The familiar surge of adrenaline, the mental calculation of damage control strategies, the reflexive reach for his laptop to start managing the crisis. But then he looked at the photo on his nightstand. Ilyas from yesterday afternoon, chocolate ice cream smeared across his face from their first shared dessert, grinning at the camera with pure, uncomplicated joy. "How bad?" Cameron asked, settling back against his pillows. 200 million bad. Plus, the Taiwanese partnership is reconsidering, and the Singapore office is asking questions about your leadership priorities. Harrison's voice cracked with stress. "Cameron, the board wants an emergency meeting. They're talking about a vote of no confidence." The words should have sent Cameron into overdrive. Should have had him reaching for his suit, calling his driver, preparing for the kind of corporate warfare that had built his reputation. Instead, he found himself thinking about Ilyas's laugh when they'd played peekaboo behind the swings yesterday, about the way his son had fallen asleep in the stroller during their walk through Central Park. "Scheduled the board meeting for Monday," Cameron said calmly. "And Harrison, next time you're in a room with international partners, remember that respect is earned through listening, not through proving you're the smartest person at the table." "That's it." Harrison's voice pitched higher with disbelief. "That's your response to losing the biggest deal of the quarter." Cameron looked out his bedroom window at the city skyline, the glass and steel monuments to ambition that had once felt like extensions of himself. Now they just looked like expensive boxers where people spent their lives chasing things that didn't matter. "My response is that we'll survive losing a deal," Cameron said quietly. "Companies lose deals every day. But I almost lost my family because I thought work was more important than the people who actually love me." The silence on Harrison's end stretched long enough that Cameron wondered if his CFO was having a breakdown. "Are you having some kind of midlife crisis?" Harrison finally asked. "Because if you are, couldn't it wait until after we saved the company from financial disaster?" Cameron laughed, actually laughed at the absurdity of it all. "Harrison, do you have kids?" "What? No. What does that have to do with anything? Do you want kids someday?" "I guess eventually." "But Cameron, what?" "Then let me give you some free advice," Cameron interrupted. "Don't wait until eventually. Don't wait until the next deal closes or the next quarter ends or the next promotion comes through, because eventually turns into never. And never is a regret that no amount of money can fix." When he hung up, Cameron's phone immediately started buzzing with calls from board members, investors, and financial journalists who'd somehow already gotten wind of the Seoul disaster. He turned the phone off and tossed it into his dresser drawer. For the first time in 15 years, Cameron Vale was unreachable during a corporate crisis. Instead, he made coffee, scrambled eggs, and thought about how he was going to spend the day with his son. It was Friday, which meant Isabel had a work meeting at noon, and Cameron had volunteered to watch Elias for the afternoon. They'd planned to visit the Children's Museum, followed by lunch at the diner near Isabel's apartment, where Elias could practice his newfound obsession with throwing Cheerios on the floor. Simple plans, ordinary plans, the kind of plans that used to feel like wasted time, but now felt like the most important appointments on his calendar. When Cameron arrived at Isabel's apartment at 11:45 a.m., she took one look at his face and frowned. What happened? Soul fell through the board once, my head on a platter. Harrison thinks I've lost my mind. Cameron shrugged as if he were discussing the weather. How's Elias this morning? Isabel stared at him with an expression somewhere between confusion and concern. Cameron, if your company is in crisis, my company will figure it out, Cameron said, kneeling down to where Elias was sitting on his playmat, building an elaborate tower of blocks that defied several laws of physics. But this guy has been working on architectural masterpieces all morning, and I promised to help him knock them down. As if on cue, Elias looked up at Cameron and squealed with delight, immediately abandoning his block tower to crawl over and pull himself up using Cameron's legs. The blocks scattered across the floor in a colorful explosion that Elias found absolutely hilarious. Da da da, Elias babbled, patting Cameron's knee with both hands. I think he's actually trying to say daddy, Isabel said softly, and Cameron felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. Are you sure? Cameron asked, lifting Elias up and settling him on his hip with the natural ease that had developed over their weeks together. Pretty sure. He's been practicing it for days. Isabel smiled, but Cameron could see the worry lines around her eyes. Cameron, are you really okay losing a deal that big? I know how much your company means to you. Cameron looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the woman who divorced him, but the woman who'd carried his child alone, who'd built a life without him, who'd somehow found the grace to let him back into their world, despite everything he'd done wrong. My company used to mean everything to me, Cameron said honestly, but that was before I understood the difference between building an empire and building a family. Elias chose that moment to grab Cameron's nose and giggle, as if agreeing with his father's priorities. The board meeting is on Monday, Cameron continued. They'll probably try to remove me as CEO. They might succeed, and you know what? If they do, maybe it's time for me to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. And what would that be? Cameron looked down at Elias, who was now trying to eat his father's shirt collar with the focused determination of someone tackling an important project. A dad, Cameron said simply. A really, really good dad. Isabel's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Cameron thought he'd said something wrong. But then she smiled, the kind of smile he remembered from their early days together before work and ambition and emotional distance had built walls between them. You already are, she said softly. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over Manhattan, promising the kind of downpour that would flood the subways and strand commuters and create exactly the kind of chaos that the old Cameron would have seen as a business opportunity. But as Cameron settled onto the floor to help Elias rebuild his block tower, he realized that sometimes the most important storms weren't the ones happening outside. Sometimes they were the ones that washed away everything you thought you wanted, leaving space for what you actually needed. The boardroom at Vale Industries felt like a courtroom on Monday morning, with Cameron sitting at one end of the mahogany table, facing 12 of the most powerful investors in New York. But unlike the courthouse, where his marriage had nearly ended, Cameron felt completely calm. He'd spent Sunday afternoon teaching Elias to clap his hands, and the memory of his son's delighted laughter was worth more than all the quarterly reports spread across the table. Cameron, began Victoria Sterling, the silver-haired chairwoman of the board, we need to discuss your recent prioritization choices. Cameron had known Victoria for 8 years. She'd been instrumental in Vale Industries' expansion into European markets and had never questioned his judgment before. The fact that she was leading this intervention spoke volumes about how seriously the board viewed his recent behavior. By all means, Cameron replied, settling back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone who had nothing left to prove. You missed the soul crisis, stated Harrison from across the table, his face pale with the strain of the past few days. $200 million evaporated while you were, what did you tell Vivian? Having a meeting about ducks and swings. Several board members exchanged glances. In the corporate world they inhabited, choosing playground equipment over profit margins wasn't just unusual, it was incomprehensible. That's correct, Cameron confirmed, without a hint of defensiveness. Cameron. Victoria's voice carried the careful tone of someone addressing a person having a breakdown. We're concerned that you're not thinking clearly. The stress of your divorce, the pressure of single fatherhood. Perhaps you need some time away to recover your perspective. My perspective has never been clearer, Cameron replied. For 15 years, I built this company by sacrificing everything else in my life. I missed family dinners, anniversary dates, friends' weddings, my own health. I told myself it was temporary, that once we reached the next milestone, I'd have time for the people I loved. He paused, looking around the table at faces that had once intimidated him, that had once held the power to validate or destroy his sense of worth. But there's always another milestone, isn't there? Another deal, another expansion, another crisis that only I can handle. And while I was chasing all of that, my wife gave birth to my son alone. My child's first word, first step, first smile. I missed all of it because I was convinced that money was more important than moments. Those moments don't pay salaries or fund pension plans, interjected Douglas Thorne, a man who'd inherited his board seat along with his father's steel fortune. We have responsibilities to our employees, our shareholders. You're absolutely right, Cameron agreed, surprising everyone. We do have responsibilities, but I finally learned the difference between being responsible and being irreplaceable. This company succeeded not because I was indispensable, but because we hired brilliant people, and then I refused to trust them to do their jobs. Harrison shifted uncomfortably. The Soul deal was handled poorly by someone who was trying to be me instead of being himself. Cameron finished. Harrison, you're an excellent CFO when you're not trying to channel my negotiation style. The Soul deal failed because I created a culture where everyone felt they had to imitate my approach, instead of bringing their own strengths to the table. Victoria leaned forward, her expression sharp with business instinct. So, what are you proposing? That you step down as CEO to spend more time with your family? Actually, Cameron said, pulling out a folder he'd prepared over the weekend, I'm proposing something more radical than that. He slid copies of his proposal across the table. I'm restructuring my role. No more international travel, unless it's absolutely critical. No more 16-hour days. No more being available 24/7 for every minor crisis. Instead, I want to focus on long-term strategy and company culture, while empowering our department heads to make decisions without my constant approval. The room erupted in concerned murmurs. This wasn't the Cameron Vale they'd known for 8 years, the man who'd built an empire through sheer force of will and an inability to delegate. The shareholders will never accept this, Douglas said flatly. You're talking about fundamentally changing how this company operates. Then maybe it's time for the shareholders to decide what kind of company they want to invest in, Cameron replied. One that burns through CEOs every few years because we demand impossible work-life balance, or one that demonstrates you can build sustainable success without destroying the people who create it. Victoria studied the proposal with the careful attention of someone who'd been making high-stakes decisions for 3 decades. This is quite a gamble, Cameron. You're betting that our competitors won't gain an advantage while you're learning too. What did you call it? Trust your team. I'm betting that a CEO who's present and focused will create more value than one who's physically present but emotionally absent. Cameron responded, and if I'm wrong, if the company suffers because I choose to be a father as well as a businessman, then you can replace me with someone who's willing to sacrifice everything for profit margins. The silence that followed felt like the pause before a verdict. Harrison spoke first, his voice uncertain but curious. What if this actually works? What if we discover that trusting people to do their jobs makes everyone more effective? Then we'll have built something sustainable instead of something that depends on one person burning out for everyone else's benefit, Cameron replied. Victoria set down the proposal and looked at Cameron with an expression he couldn't quite read. You realize that if we agree to this experiment and it fails, your career in corporate leadership is probably over. Cameron thought about Elias learning to clap, about the weight of his son sleeping against his chest, about Isabel's smile when she'd said, "You already are a good dad." Some things are worth the risk, Cameron said simply. The vote was closer than it should have been. 7 in favor, 5 opposed. But Cameron's restructuring proposal was approved with a 6-month trial period. As the board members filed out discussing implementation details and risk assessments, Victoria lingered behind. I have to ask Cameron, what really changed? 3 months ago, you would have fought tooth and nail to maintain control of every aspect of this company. Cameron smiled, thinking of 12 tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, of babbled conversations that meant more than any boardroom negotiation he'd ever conducted. 3 months ago, I thought success meant being needed by everyone, Cameron said. Now I know it means being loved by the people who matter most. That evening, Cameron sat on the floor of Isabel's living room, watching Elias stack blocks with the intense concentration of an architect designing a skyscraper. The news was playing quietly in the background, something about market volatility and corporate restructuring, but Cameron wasn't listening. Da, Elias said clearly, looking directly at Cameron as he handed over a red block. Yes, Cameron whispered, accepting the block like it was made of gold. I'm your daddy, and I'm not going anywhere. Isabel looked up from her laptop where she'd been working on client presentations and smiled at the scene in front of her. You know, a few months ago, I never would have imagined this. What, you hear, choosing blocks over board meetings. Cameron considered this as Elias crawled into his lap, settling against his chest with the complete trust that only children possess. A few months ago, I wouldn't have understood that this is the most important meeting of my day, Cameron replied. Every day. As if to prove his point, Elias reached up and patted Cameron Unk's cheek, babbling something that sounded remarkably like, "Love you, too." And in that moment, surrounded by scattered toys and baby books instead of financial reports and acquisition plans, Cameron realized that he hadn't lost anything at all. He'd finally found everything that mattered. 2 years later. The swing set in Central Park squeaked with the familiar rhythm of a lazy Sunday afternoon in early spring. Cameron pushed Elias gently, watching his now 2.5-year-old son pump his little legs with determination, trying to swing higher all by himself. Higher, Daddy, Elias called out, his vocabulary having exploded over the past year into full sentences that never failed to amaze Cameron. I want to touch the clouds. Hold on tight, buddy. Cameron laughed, giving the swing another push. I'll get you there. From the bench nearby, Isabel looked up from the book she was reading. Not a parenting manual this time, but an actual novel, something she'd barely had time for during Elias's first year. She was wearing a sundress that brought out the gold highlights in her hair, and when she smiled at Cameron, he still felt that familiar flutter in his chest. Remember when you thought you'd be bored by this? She called out, gesturing at the playground around them. Cameron did remember. 2 years ago, the idea of spending entire afternoons in parks, pushing swings, and building sandcastles had seemed like torture. Now these Sunday afternoons were the highlight of his week. I was an idiot, Cameron replied, catching Elias as he jumped from the swing with the fearless confidence of a toddler who trusted his father completely. But I'm a reformed idiot. The restructuring at Vale Industries had worked better than anyone expected. By empowering his department heads and stepping back from day-to-day crisis management, Cameron had discovered that the company actually ran more smoothly without his constant interference. Stock prices had reached all-time highs, employee satisfaction had soared, and Cameron had been featured on the cover of Fortune magazine with the headline, "The CEO Who Chose Family First." But the real success wasn't measured in quarterly reports. Daddy, watch this, Elias announced, climbing onto a small slide with the serious expression he wore whenever attempting something he considered extremely important. Cameron watched with complete attention as his son slid down the 3-foot slide as if conquering Mount Everest. When Elias reached the bottom, Cameron cheered as if his son had just won an Olympic medal. Did you see, Mama? Elias ran to Isabel, who scooped him up for a congratulatory hug. I saw everything, Isabel assured him. You were very brave, Mama. The words still sent a warm glow through Cameron Unk's chest. 6 months ago, Isabel had quietly moved back into the house they'd once shared, not as his wife, but as his partner in raising their son, and tentatively in rebuilding whatever it was they'd once had together. They weren't married again, not yet, but they were family in all the ways that mattered. Ice cream truck, Elias announced, with the gravity of someone reporting breaking news, pointing at the familiar white vehicle that had just rounded the corner. What do you think, Mama? Cameron asked, pulling out his wallet. Should we spoil his dinner? It's Sunday, Isabel replied with mock seriousness. Sunday is for spoiling dinners. As Cameron walked with Elias toward the ice cream truck, his son's small hand warm in his own, his phone buzzed with what was probably an urgent email from Harrison, or a text from his assistant about Monday's meetings. Cameron glanced at it briefly, then turned the phone off without reading the message. Some things he'd learned could wait until Monday. Daddy, Elias said as they stood in line behind a group of teenagers who were debating the merits of various ice cream flavors with the intensity of a United Nations summit. Do you have to go to work tomorrow? I do have to go to work, Cameron replied honestly, but I'll be home for dinner, and bath time, and story time. Will you read the dragon book? I'll read whichever book you want, Cameron promised and meant it. The ice cream vendor, a cheerful man named Roberto, who'd been working this corner of Central Park for 15 years, smiled when he saw them approach. The usual for the young man, Roberto asked, already reaching for the chocolate cone with rainbow sprinkles that had become Elias's standard order. Please, Cameron replied, then added, and one vanilla for me. As they walked back to where Isabel was still reading on the bench, Elias chattering about the dogs they passed and the flowers that were just beginning to bloom in the nearby garden beds, Cameron felt a profound sense of contentment that had nothing to do with stock prices or acquisition deals. Mama, I got you some, Elias announced, offering Isabel a lick of his ice cream cone with the generous spirit of someone who'd been taught to share. Thank you, baby, Isabel replied, accepting the slightly melted offering with the same grace she might have received a bouquet of roses. They sat together on the bench, Elias between his parents, sticky fingers and chocolate smiles, and the easy conversation of people who'd learned to be present for each other's lives. I got a call from Jasper yesterday, Cameron mentioned as Elias became absorbed in the complex task of eating ice cream without dropping it. He wants to know if we're coming to Lucy's birthday party next weekend. Of course we are, Isabel replied. Elias has been talking about his cousin's party for weeks. Cameron smiled, thinking of his brother's family gatherings that he'd missed for years due to work obligations. Now they were regular attendees at birthday parties and barbecues, part of the extended family network he'd almost lost through neglect. Cameron, Isabel said quietly, can I ask you something? Always. Do you ever miss it? The adrenaline rush of closing big deals, the power of making decisions that move markets. Cameron considered the question seriously. 2 years ago, his identity had been so wrapped up in being indispensable that he couldn't imagine finding fulfillment in anything else. Sometimes, he admitted, but then Elias calls me daddy, or you smile at me the way you used to when we were dating, or I realize I've been present for every major moment of my son's life for the past 2 years. And I remember that the most important deals aren't the ones that make money. What are they? Cameron looked at his son, who had finished his ice cream and was now trying to feed imaginary ice cream to a nearby pigeon, chattering to the bird in the serious tone he used for important conversations. They're the ones that make memories, Cameron said simply. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, they packed up their things and began the familiar walk home. Elias rode on Cameron's shoulders, pointing out every interesting sight: fire trucks, construction cranes, a man walking 3 dogs at once with the enthusiasm of someone discovering the world for the first time. Daddy, Elias said as they waited for a traffic light to change, I love you to the moon and back, and around the sun. I love you to the moon and back and around the sun and to all the stars, Cameron replied, their usual escalating game of affection. And to Jupiter, Elias added with triumph. And to Jupiter, Cameron agreed, his voice thick with emotion that still caught him off guard sometimes. When they reached their street, Isabel slipped her hand into Cameron's free hand with the natural ease of someone who belonged there. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt like coming home after a very long journey. Thank you, Cameron said quietly. For what? For not giving up on us, for letting me learn how to be the man you deserved all along, for raising our son to be generous and brave and full of love even when I wasn't around to help. Isabel squeezed his hand. You're around now. That's what matters. That evening, after Elias was bathed and fed and tucked into bed with his favorite stuffed dinosaur, Cameron and Isabel sat on their front porch with glasses of wine and the comfortable silence of people who no longer felt the need to fill every moment with words. The city hummed around them, traffic and sirens, and the distant sound of music from someone's open window. But their small corner felt peaceful, separate from the urgency that had once defined Cameron's entire existence. What are you thinking about? Isabel asked, noticing the contemplative expression on Cameron Unk's face. Time, Cameron replied. How I spent 38 years thinking I didn't have enough of it when really I just wasn't spending it on the right things. And now, Cameron smiled, thinking of all the Sunday afternoons ahead of them, all the bedtime stories and ice cream cones and swing-pushing sessions that would make up the real texture of their lives together. Now, I know that time isn't something you save up for later, he said. It's something you spend every day on the people who make it worth having. From upstairs came the sound of Elias talking to his dinosaur, in this serious whisper he used for bedtime conversations. probably explaining the day's adventures and making plans for tomorrow's imaginary expeditions. Cameron listened to his son's voice, confident, happy, secure in the knowledge that his parents would be there. When he woke up and realized that this was what success actually sounded like. Not the applause of a boardroom or the ring of closing bells, but the sleepy chatter of a child who knew he was loved. Cameron Vale had built an empire worth billions, but his greatest achievement was learning that the most valuable currency in the world wasn't money, it was moments. And finally, after almost losing everything that mattered, he was rich beyond measure. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.